Good afternoon and good morning. My name is Victor Pinchuk, and on behalf of the board of Yalta European Strategy, let me welcome you to our conversation with Niall Ferguson and Fareed Zakaria. Fareed and Niall will analyze the impact of coronavirus on the world and Ukraine and ways forward. Fareed just published his great book on this, 10 Lessons for a Post-Pandemic World. It's a very sharp analysis and outlook. And very rightly, it got fantastic reviews and is on the all bestsellers lists now. Because of COVID, our year's traditional meeting in Kyiv will happen only in 2021, hopefully. And until then, some of the world's greatest minds and important decision makers agreed to get together online to analyze global challenges and what they mean for Ukraine. Last time we had conversation with Deputy Secretary of the United States, Stephen Biegun, and Anne Applebaum. In 2 days, we will have very interesting online conversation with Richard Haas and John Bolton about American election. But today we have really great pleasure to have Fareed and Niall. Fareed, thank you for joining us to discuss your great book. And Niall, thank you that you agreed to be Fareed's conversation partner. From your combined huge intellectual firepower, we expect some excellent advices. And now, floor is yours.
Thank you, Victor. It's a pleasure to be with you, even if we're together virtually rather than in real space. We look forward to our return to Kiev for the 2021 conference. Fareed, let me just first express my envy that you've managed to get a book out so swiftly. You make the rest of us look like tortoises. And I want to congratulate you on the book. And I'm doing this to signal that unlike our last encounter at YES 2019, this is going to be a conversation and not a debate. For those of you who have been on another planet over the last 20 years, I'll do a quick introduction of Fareed. He's best known for his CNN show, Fareed Zakaria GPS, which I was kind of amazed to find now has been going since 2008. His column in the Washington Post is a must-read. Fareed is a native-born Indian from Mumbai. I call it Bombay. I'm old-fashioned. He's a Yale-educated, Harvard-educated public intellectual whose books have been consistently defining of the moment since he began publishing. I first came across his work nearly 20 years ago when I reviewed The Future of Freedom. His book, The Post-American World, was one of the first in 2008 to identify that the United States might no longer be the dominant player, at least in the remainder of our lives. This new book, 10 Lessons for a Post-Pandemic World, in addition to being hair-like in its speed of execution and publication, once again defines the moment in a way that I think will be hugely influential. It's a 10-chapter, 10-lesson book, and I think maybe, Fareed, just to help those who haven't yet read it, I'll just read out the chapter titles to give listeners a sense of what your book is about. Chapter 1 is Buckle Up. Chapter 2, What Matters is Not the Quantity of Government, but the Quality. Chapter 3, markets are not enough. Chapter 4, people should listen to the experts and experts should listen to the people. Chapter 5, life is digital. Chapter 6, Aristotle was right, we are social animals. Chapter 7, inequality will get worse. Chapter 8, globalization is not dead. Chapter 9, the world is becoming bipolar. And chapter 10, sometimes the greatest realists are the idealists. Fried, I read the book from cover to cover last night ahead of our conversation. And I was left with one big question that I want to start with. I'm not sure, having read the book, how much you think COVID-19 has changed the world, because it seems to me most of the trends that you write about were there before. And indeed, if COVID-19 hadn't happened, if that nasty zoonotic virus hadn't made the leap from a Chinese bat to humans and then from human to human, you could still have written this book. It would have been called The Post-2020 World, but it would have been essentially the same book. Am I right?
Firstly, Neil, let me just thank you for all the kind words and for really having been an intellectual pace setter. I don't know how one would describe the kind of person, usually you're influenced enormously by people who are, a generation older than you, people like that. But with Niall Ferguson, I had this extraordinary experience of beginning my public intellectual life always aware of this great looming presence. Somewhat, different set of skills than mine. Niall is one of the great historians. For those of you who have never read his history of the Rothschilds, it really is one of the truly great biographies, and much more than a biography. And then we happened to get to know each other and discovered that we liked each other even when we disagreed. So for me, this is a huge honor and a huge pleasure. Victor, thank you as always. The only problem with meeting with Victor Pinchuk virtually is that one does not get the inevitable great glass of wine. So we will have to pretend that we are enjoying ourselves as much as we would were we in Victor's company physically. So with that out of the way, Niall, of course you are right. The way I would describe it, there's a line of Lenin's. Now I say it's a line of Lenin's. I tried to figure out whether he actually said it. And it turns out it's not clear, but the line, as we journalists say, is too good to check. So I will use it anyway. Lenin is supposed to have said that there are decades when nothing happens, and then there are weeks when decades happen. And in a sense, that is the argument I would make, that COVID-19 has been the great accelerator. It has taken trends that were already happening, and it has massively accelerated them. But I think sometimes that when you accelerate phenomena or structural change so far, so fast, it can have a fairly dramatic effect that might not have happened had the same thing happened, proceeded slowly. Let me give you two examples. Inequality. As I think you would agree, Niall, this is one of the most dramatic effects of COVID. I mean, we are all able to function. Some inconveniences, Zoom is awkward, all that. But for everybody working in a restaurant, in a hotel, in a mall, on cruise ships, in theme parks, this is the Great Depression. The work has just disappeared. Now, those people tend to be low wage anyway. So that widening chasm between them, the chasm between the countries that can spend freely because they can issue debt in their own currency versus those that have to borrow in a foreign currency, in other words, between the rich and the poor among nations, massively expanding. The fact that we are going to exacerbate these changes so far, so fast, might lead to a politics that is pretty unpredictable and could get quite nasty. Similarly, something you and I have talked about a lot, the increasing tensions between the United States and China are now on a kind of fast forward. And one wonders whether these same forces, had they gathered pace slowly, had countries had time to digest them, had societies had time to work out some of the human reactions and adaptations, would they be different? But I think you're right. When I look at the main forces I'm describing, I would say that the principal conclusion I come to is that the pandemic has been the great accelerator, not the transformative wave that some others are talking about.
So Fareed, you argue that COVID is nature's revenge on us because we've played fast and loose and recklessly with the planet in a whole range of ways. You argue in the first chapter that this is a bigger crisis than 9/11 or the financial crisis of 2008, 2009. And then you make, I think, an extremely important argument that the key here is not really the quantity of government, but the quality. And you also, I think, nicely deal with the quite widely argued view that the crisis has somehow been good for authoritarians and bad for democracy, good for China and bad for the United States. Let's talk a bit about the argument in chapter 2, because I think I agree with you. It's not possible to simply say democracies have underperformed autocracies, is it?
No, you're exactly right. And I just want to highlight one point that you made at the start, Neil, which is, if we all think about it, I was talking to an Indian businessman, mid-sized Indian businessman after the global financial crisis. And he had made the point to me, which I still remember, which was that we in the West were obsessing about things that had actually had no effect on his life. 9/11, he said, had no effect on his life. It was, it was something between America and a small number of Middle Eastern countries. It changed some of the travel procedures in airports a little bit. Other than that, it had no effect on his life. He pointed out that the global financial crisis, it reduced demand a little bit because of the global recession, but he didn't have any financially leveraged products. He didn't have derivatives. It didn't change his life much. This pandemic has really affected everyone. I mean, it's very difficult to imagine a phenomenon in the world that I can think of that has literally changed the lives of every human being on the planet. Everyone has in some way been affected by either the pandemic or the lockdowns that followed. And so that, just gives you a sense of the magnitude. And you're absolutely right. When you look around, it is not the case that dictatorships have done better than democracies. If you had to tally it, and I didn't have time to do a statistical analysis, the kind you do so beautifully in your books, Neil, I think you'd find that the dictatorships come out worse, because if you think about Russia, Iran, Belarus, I mean, you think about all the places that have bungled the disease, you come up with a long list. We often forget that there are one or two dictatorships that get it right, and we'd have this peculiar tendency to then think that that means all dictatorships do well. It's the same with economic growth, as you know. China has done well with economic growth. So we say, well, that must be the answer. But think about every African dictatorship that has been a basket case economically. So if you look at COVID, really the stars are actually democratic. Taiwan is probably the country that handled it best. 24 million people. Taiwan has 7 COVID deaths. That is not a typo. And they're right next to China. They got millions of tourists from China. South Korea, again, extraordinary performance. Singapore on a per capita basis is actually lower than either of them. And Singapore, while somewhat authoritarian, is actually very open and transparent and used no special police powers to do this. It was all very openly and transparently done. The Chinese actually bungle it at first in ways that we all know, but then, to be fair to them, got control of it very, very aggressively and very well, as did Vietnam. So there are a couple of cases where dictatorships did well. In both cases, actually, it has more to do with the fact that they had great public health infrastructure than that they were dictatorships. And I think that the broader point that I was trying to make in that chapter is, look, I think we in the West are losing faith in democracy for no reason. It is not democracy that is failing us in the sense that democracies cannot perform public functions. They can. Look at South Korea. Look at Taiwan. What we have developed in the West are other scleroses. We have created bureaucracies that are very strange, cumbersome, highly politicized. As I describe it, there's a kind of an attack from the right and the left. The right defunds bureaucracies in a kind of anti-statist ideology. The left piles on mandates upon mandates. rules and regulations, unionizes the workforce in the United States, for example. And then we're surprised that those institutions, those bureaucracies don't function well. But that's not about democracy. That is about a decision that we have made, you could call it kind of late stage sclerotic capitalism or something, which has caused our problems. So I think what we have to take from this is that countries like Taiwan, which spend, by the way, a third as much on healthcare as the United States, are able to do it in a very open system. A country like South Korea, which has a state to GDP ratio, which is lower than any Western country, in fact, lower than Japan, which is the lowest of the industrialized countries, have been able to perform very well. How to do that reforming is a big challenge, but I think it's very important for people to understand that democracies can do it. It is, as I try to say, not about the quantity of government, it's the quality of government.
Fareed will say a little bit later about the election that's just days away, in fact, 1 week away in the United States. But before we get to that, is there a sort of subset of democracies that have performed badly, namely those run by populists? I'm not entirely sure I get that clearly from your book, but I sensed, particularly when you were criticizing President Trump, that your broad view is that the populism has not been the right form of democratic leadership in a crisis like this.
Yeah, I was hesitant to draw any kind of large patterns like that, Neil, because I was writing it at a time when the data could come in and disprove those patterns. But I hint at that. You're exactly right. If you look at Brazil, Britain, the United States, they've all done pretty badly. I think you could add to that India, Turkey, which have not done particularly well. And what many of these places have in common, again, I'm reluctant to make huge generalizations, but there is a distrust of experts. There is a tendency to govern by the gut. There is a tendency for these leaders to believe that they have some kind of special mandate. But I wonder, Neil, whether there's another piece to this, and I actually would love to know what you think. One of the things I notice is that the countries that did well are countries that had in some way or the other failed and then learned from that failure. So you have the obvious cases of Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore, which all did pretty badly actually with SARS and MERS, the two earlier epidemics that almost became pandemics. And they really revamped their public health infrastructure as a result of that and got prepared and acted early and aggressively. Maybe there's even a broader point. You remember that great book by Mansur Olson about why Britain and Germany after World War II had such different trajectories. Germany growing very fast and Britain rather sluggishly. And the point he made was that Germany failed in World War II. And the failure meant that it discredited all institutions and all practices in Germany, and they had to kind of build anew. Whereas the British, because they had won, sat comfortably and sclerotically in their old, aging, democratic, capitalist, regulatory infrastructure and never really modernized. And I'm struck by the fact that, the countries that have done particularly badly are also countries that have this sense of themselves as kind of exceptional. Britain, the United States, Brazil, as a famous saying in Brazil, God is Brazilian. Even the Chileans, who have spent a lot of time lauding themselves for being the East Asian country in Latin America. So could it be that the dynamics at work here is that ability to learn from failure?
I wonder about that, Fareed. To me, the striking thing is that there were plenty of European countries that were not led by populists, that didn't have a high level of self-esteem either, that did really badly too. I mean, Belgium, not led by a populist, had one of the worst excess mortality numbers in Europe. Italy, Spain. For me, the really striking thing is that there isn't a clear correlation from populism to poor performance. There were plenty of centrist, non-populist leaders who did badly. You were right to be careful because, of course, even with your high-speed execution, there's a lag between finishing the manuscript and publication. And in that lag, Europe's had the kind of second wave that the United States had earlier, during which, of course, many Europeans looked down their noses at the US. I think you make a really crucial point in, I think, the second chapter, that it's really failures of public health bureaucracies that are key here, regardless of whether you had a competent technocrat or an incompetent populace. And some learned from the experience of SARS and MERS, and others didn't. But this brings me to the question of who our role models should be in the post-pandemic world. You argue in I think the third chapter, markets are not enough, that we're kind of all part of a big pendulum swing towards the left that has been going on for some time, predated even the financial crisis, and which the pandemic has accelerated in your terms. But that chapter concludes with a, to me, surprising role model pick, Denmark. And I actually was expecting you to say Taiwan, because as you rightly say, Taiwan is the superstar of pandemic response. Why should we want to be Denmark rather than Taiwan? And isn't this a kind of category error that many on the left are making, especially in the United States, that Scandinavia is somehow socialism and therefore we should do socialism? Help me understand which the right country to copy is in the post-pandemic world.
Yeah, I mean, that is a terrific question. And I struggled with it, to be honest, Neil, because Taiwan actually, you know, on the merits, Taiwan and South Korea really are the two places that have managed this best. The reason I picked Denmark was twofold. One, I think that in a modern Western or advanced capitalist country, you are going to have some kind of a large safety net. And I actually approve of that because I think that we are going into a world in which there's going to be so much change, so many external pressures that if you want to live in a civilized society which has some degree of wealth, you are going to want to make sure that there is a bottom below which people do not fall. And as you know, in East Asia, that infrastructure is very thin. So part of what I was thinking is no Western country is going to emulate, is going to deconstruct its welfare state. And so what the Northern Europeans, in particular, Denmark, and to a certain extent, Sweden, have been able to do is combine free markets and flexibility with a reasonably generous and compassionate form of government that is also quite efficient. I think this is the big category error you were describing, which is why I resist even the thought that what I'm describing is moving left, because actually I'm moving left and right simultaneously. Denmark is on the Heritage Institute's, Heritage Foundation's Institute of Economic Freedom, higher ranking than the United States, as is Sweden, as by the way is Canada. And the reason is they take a very careful measure of all the regulatory burdens that are placed on capitalism. And it turns out the US actually has quite a few. So what the Danes have done is, very simply put, very crudely put, they have a very wide open, dynamic free market, very low tariffs, very little regulation in terms of labor. The labor force participation rates in Denmark are actually higher than in the United States, meaning it's easier to hire and fire people, and people do get hired and fired more in Denmark than in the United States. And at the same time, they have a fairly generous welfare state, but that state is really geared towards equality of opportunity. So there's a lot of investment made for pre-nursery child care, free nursery, great nutrition programs for children, free education, and of course, universal healthcare. So I think of those things as the kind of the arming that you need to do to a population to then say, now go out there into the great world economy and compete. The United States, by contrast, actually has a fairly thin welfare state, but it has enormous regulatory burdens on its businesses. This is one area where Donald Trump is actually right. I was once talking to a builder who operates both in Canada and the United States, an American. And I said, where is it easier to build? Just as a simple matter. He said, oh, Canada by far. He said, the US regulatory burden, first of all, is threefold. You have the federal, you have the state, and the local. He said, you have all kinds of unnecessary regulations, whereas in Canada, it's one simple building code applies everywhere in the country. So you can see where I'm going, which is the challenge is somehow to really embrace the openness and dynamism of an open market world economy, and at the same time provide some protections so that people can compete and you don't worry as much. I remember the Danish prime minister in the 1990s who set these reforms in motion, saying to me, I want to make it really easy for a company to fire workers. I want them to not have to worry that the worker is going to lose healthcare. I want them to not have to worry that this is going to plunge the worker into a generation of poverty. I want them to shed workers when they don't need them. And for that, I have to create a good healthcare system and a good unemployment insurance system. So it's a very interesting model. And I worry sometimes that what I'm saying will be taken to be simply embrace more government, which is not where I would like to go.
So Fareed, in chapter 5, Life is Digital, you make the argument, which has been made by a number of people in Silicon Valley, that this is a sort of fast forward experience, taking us to where we would probably have got to 10 years from now in 10 months' time. There's one thing I wanted to press you on, though, and that's contact tracing. Because it seems to me that one of the great mysteries of COVID-19 is why Western countries, nearly all Western countries, utterly failed to take advantage of the technology that the Taiwanese made use of, namely digital cell phone-based, smartphone-based contact tracing. We have the biggest technology companies in the world here in the United States. We have more data probably on individual citizens than just about any country. It's just that the data are in the hands of Facebook and Apple and Google. Why did the Western countries fail to do what the Taiwanese did, which was really to take advantage of technology to do contact tracing in a systematic way? Because that seems to me one of the reasons that the Taiwanese did so well. It wasn't just that they ramped up testing and were quick off the mark. They also used digital contact tracing to make sure that if there were any cases, they very quickly established who might have been in contact with those infected people.
Well, you're absolutely right about the Taiwanese model and what made it successful. And I tried to dig into this, and actually some of this happened after I wrote the book. And I talked to the Taiwanese vice president who actually ran the program. And it's very interesting. So he points out that, yes, in fact, they did use the digital technology. But the most important piece of this, he argues, was not the testing, not the tracing, but the quarantining of the then potentially infected. In other words, in Taiwan, what they did was they said, if you have it, we're going to figure out who you've been in contact with, and those people have to then quarantine. And they were quarantined in a fairly intrusive manner. Those people were then given cell phones, government cell phones, which they had to keep on them all the time. They had to stay where they were, in the place that they were sheltering in place. The government would call randomly, usually 3 times a day. If you didn't pick up the phone, that was itself evidence of violating the quarantine, and there were very heavy fines for it. The Singaporeans did something similar. And in both cases, they pointed out the digital wasn't enough. They had to do old-fashioned detective work, because you had to talk to people, because as the Singaporean guy who was running the program said to me, you go to a coffee shop, you go to a restaurant, you go to a retail store. We don't know how many people you were in contact with, whether you were talking to people face to face, whether it was a 5-second conversation, whether it was a 15-minute conversation. All we know is you were in the Starbucks for 20 minutes, but how long were you talking to somebody, So we had to flesh these things out. But the key, they all said, was isolating those people who could be infected. Because, the way the Taiwanese vice president put it to me, he said, look, the way to think about COVID, it doesn't just spread randomly. It's actually very much a product of these spreading clusters. So the key is the minute you figure out that somebody's infected, you remove from circulation all the people who could potentially be infected, and that preserves life for the other people. One of the least known facts about the most successful countries' handling of COVID is none of them did a lockdown. A lockdown, the Taiwanese vice president said to me, is actually evidence that you have failed, because it is a big, blunt instrument that has enormous costs to society. What you're trying to do is to, as he put it, you're sacrificing the freedom of movement of a small part of your population for 14 days so that the rest of the population can continue to work. So in Taiwan, he said the sum total of people they quarantined was 250,000, 1% of the population, so that the other 99% could live life essentially normally, which is what happened in Taiwan, largely in South Korea, largely in Singapore. We sort of failed because we never got that system going. And so we had to then do these horrible lockdowns, which the Europeans are now again doing. And I'm not a big fan of these lockdowns. I think that it's certainly the case, as you know, I write in the book, that in poor countries, the lockdown causes more deaths than the disease itself. In India, more children have died as a result of COVID from malnutrition than the total number of people who have died from COVID. And that's just the children.
Yeah, so I completely agree with you about this. And it seems to me that's exactly why we should be looking much more closely at Taiwan than at Denmark. To me, the mystery is we're here at the end of October and the Western world still hasn't learned from Taiwan. So we're going through this whole process of second phase lockdowns in a way that I think future historians will find extraordinarily difficult to explain. And when people say to me, oh, we couldn't possibly do what the Taiwanese did, that would be so intrusive on civil liberties, I just am stunned, because what we've done is so much more of a violation of civil liberties. We basically placed the population of multiple states under house arrest, including California and New York, where we spend a good deal of our time. There's a limited amount of time left for us, and there's one big question that I've been saving for towards the end, and that's Cold War II. In chapter 9, you say the world is becoming bipolar. And it's certainly been my view since before the pandemic that we're already in the early innings of Cold War II. Tell us a little bit about your thinking on this, because I sense that you're not really in favor of Cold War II, even although you agree with me that the world has got a lot more bipolar in the last few years. What are the geopolitical consequences of COVID-19?
Yeah, I mean, as often is the case, Neil, you have a sharp an acuity with which you see things, which is kind of unsentimental. And the more I looked at the data, the more I came to the conclusion you were right. The world is kind of essentially already bipolar. I was struck by this in the sense that I realized China was the second largest economy in the world. I didn't realize that it was now larger than the next 4 economies put together. It's the second largest military in the world by spending. Again, it is larger than the next 4 militaries put together. And if you go back just 15 years and look at the size of the Russian military compared to the Chinese military, it's a wonderful example of these two trend lines, the Chinese just rising, and the Russians slowly but surely declining. So we're in a bipolar world, and the Chinese are a real peer competitor. You talk to, people like Eric Schmidt, the former CEO of Google, and he says, in his view, China is at least on par, if not ahead of the United States in every major computer-based technology, machine learning, quantum computing, all those kinds of things. Now, the point I was trying to get at is I do think we're in a somewhat different world than Cold War I. Part of what makes me wonder whether we will have Cold War II is that we are living in a much more deeply interconnected world and a much more multilateral world, by which I mean lots of countries are more empowered than they were in the 1940s, 50s, 60s. You have countries like Brazil and Turkey and India. You have a unified, quasi-unified European Union. It's difficult to imagine that bipolar world of the 50s where, the rest of the world was almost pawns on a chessboard that was being played by the two sides, black and white. Part of it is the depth of the interconnections economically and technologically, which you've written about so well. At the height of the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union did $2 billion of trade a year. The United States and China do $2 billion of trade every day. And that is why you see even the Trump administration has a kind of schizophrenia about how to handle China. On the one hand, Lighthizer, the trade negotiator, goes to the Chinese and say, we want you to buy more American goods, and we want you to open your markets up to American firms. Now that's asking for more interdependence, right? You're asking for more contact, communication, commerce between these two countries. On the other hand, you have Peter Navarro and other parts of the White House saying, we want to decouple technologically. We want you to have your Huawei and we will have our, we don't actually have an alternative to it yet, but to be named alternative. And that is a kind of effort to say, we just need to separate. And I suspect the separation is going to be hard. If it happens, it's going to be very costly and very painful. And it kind of leads us to a breakdown of globalization. I think you cannot imagine the kind of open global economy if you have two distinct spheres with the two major economies on each side of it. It's a breakdown technologically. And so maybe there's a little bit of wishful thinking, but I do believe it's very suboptimal. And at the end of the day, Neil, I'm a sort of optimistic capitalist, by which I mean, I think the logic of capitalism and free trade are very powerful. They help countries out of poverty. They help countries address their problems of growth. And that ultimately that logic will force us to have some kind of restraint on a nakedly realpolitik Cold War in which the two sides just engage in, arms races in everything from nuclear weapons to space to cyber to artificial intelligence. It could happen. I mean, I've certainly realized that there are trend lines in that direction. It would be a different and a more dangerous world if it did.
If we are in something like Cold War II or Cold War Light, what does that mean for a country like Ukraine? There are a great many countries, Ukraine is only one of them, that are uncomfortably between these two superpowers. And I think of Russia increasingly as an appendage of Chinese superpower, certainly a junior partner to Xi Jinping. What does this world, this post-pandemic world that you've written about mean for Ukraine, country that we're in many ways addressing in this conversation?
Well, you hinted at it, Neil. I think it could turn out to be problematic because the last place you want to be if you have one of these great divisions is to be stuck in the middle in a kind of no man's land. And I think Ukraine does face that possibility. First of all, the more China rises and the more Russia declines, the less central Ukraine becomes to the West, and the less central Ukraine's fate becomes to the West. And in that circumstance, you also have the reality that the pressure goes off Ukraine to reform. Fundamentally, Ukraine's problem is first and foremost that it needs to be secure and independent. And in order to do that, it needs the support of the West in a fairly unqualified way. But the second part is that Ukraine has to reform. It has to find a way to viably build its institutions and viably create the kind of open economy, deal with corruption, all those things. And that requires a degree of independence and protection. So I sometimes think of Ukraine the way one thinks about the best case scenario for Ukraine is South Korea. South Korea became part of the American sphere, somewhat accidentally. Most people don't realize the United States actually had originally written South Korea out of its sphere of influence. Then the North Koreans attack. The US comes to the aid of South Korea. And then it becomes part of the American sphere. And the United States gives it protection. It gives it some aid. It actually supports a pretty nasty dictator for a while, Syngman Rhee. But over time, South Korea modernizes, and that modernization gets accelerated in the last 20 years. And now you have this remarkable country that is capitalist, democratic, modern, increasingly modern. That should be Ukraine's goal, to try to figure out how to use the fact that it has Western support to create independence, get rid of corruption, create a functioning market economy with a limited but effective state. And in doing that, if it becomes constantly worried about its security, it's very hard to do that. You need some degree of assurance. And so I would hope the West will provide more of that. But the Ukrainians also have to take advantage of that process and use it to reform, use the pressure and maybe the promise. I remember a Turkish reformer once saying to me, This was the month that Angela Merkel and Nicolas Sarkozy made clear that Turkey would never be part of the European Union. And he accurately predicted to me, he said, we've had 10 years of consistent reform in Turkey. It's all going to stop. He said, it'll take a few years, but it's all going to stop, because the magnet of the reforms in Turkey was the possibility of being part of Europe. If we lose that magnet, we lose the pressure to reform. So the Ukrainians have to keep that pressure on themselves. The West has to help by providing some security and some guarantees, but ultimately the Ukrainians have to do this. And I have to say, looking at COVID, Ukraine has not handled this too well. You know, if you look at the numbers now, they have a massive spike going up. And as you say, Neil, to me, the most puzzling part about all this is we're 8 months into this, we know what works. We've seen it work. We've seen with all these spikes taking place in the West, there are no spikes. So the spikes in places like Korea and Singapore are just tiny in comparison to what we're dealing with. And yet, we don't seem to figure out how to be able to do it. We understand you don't need a dictatorship. You can do a mixture of incentives and disincentives. You know, my son goes to Yale, and they have a very strict regimen where if somebody gets test positive, their cohort, everybody that person has been in contact with, has to self-quarantine. Now you could say they have some authority, because presumably you get kicked out of college if you violated it, but most people know that's not likely. It's just a lot of social pressure, and it's a certain amount of incentives, positive incentives. So it's not impossible for us to do this as democracies, but we kind of have to start recognizing, you know, we failed, the East Asians succeeded. You learn from failure, and you learn from other people's success. And until we do that, whether it's Ukraine or the United States or Britain, we're not going to move forward.
Fareed, we've got only a couple of minutes left. We're 1 week away as we speak from a US election. You doubled down in your column the other day. You said, I was wrong 4 years ago. I'm going to be darn wrong again, maybe, but I'm going to back the Democrat to win this. Do you feel a certain queasiness when you hit send on a column like that, predicting a Democratic victory when 4 years ago it went the other way, to the great amazement of everybody? Or do you think this is a slam dunk for Joe Biden? No, I don't think it's a slam dunk for Joe Biden. I think that, you know, a lot of it depends on the intensity of the support that Trump is able to get out of his, you know, let's face it, minority support, by which I mean he lost the popular vote even the last time. I think, you know, there is an alternate way to view this, which is probably my preferred way, which is that Trump has never been that popular. He's always had a majority of Americans disapprove of him. He has the lowest approval ratings of any president since Harry Truman, and including Harry Truman. In other words, since we've had modern Poland. Who got re-elected in 1948 against all the expectations and all the opinion polls. True. And that's why I think you're exactly right to say that, that's why I say it's not a slam dunk. But I think that the two factors that seem to be helping him here, Joe Biden, are the fact that clearly there was an element of the public that disapproved of Trump, but just didn't like Hillary Clinton. She was the second most unpopular presidential candidate in modern history after Trump. Biden doesn't evoke that kind of negative feeling. So the fact that the Democrats were able to put up a fairly generic mainstream Democrat seems to be helping. It isn't turning off people in quite the same way. And the second, frankly, is COVID. I don't know that Trump would be where he is without COVID, because COVID has in some ways symbolized Trump's kind of laissez-faire attitude towards government, the level of incompetence, the distrust of experts, the going by the gut, all the bad things about Trump, in some weird way got symbolized by COVID. I think otherwise, he had actually a very fair chance of getting reelected. So I don't say that this was inevitable, but I think you take COVID and you take the fact that Biden is mainstream enough that he doesn't turn a lot of people off. Now it could, let me put it this way. I think we might be surprised on the upside as well. You were all ready for the surprise that Trump will pull this off somehow.
but don't be surprised. I mean, the early voting numbers seem disproportionately young voters, minorities, and we know how those people vote. So there's a possibility that we get surprised on the other side as well.
Well, Fareed, we are out of time, but for those who want to hear more on the subjects of the upcoming US election, I have good news. In 2 days' time, the next conversation in this Yes series will be between Gillian Tett and John Bolton and Richard Haas on this very subject of the US election. It only remains for me to thank Victor Pinchuk for convening us in this conversation, to you, the audience, for listening in, and above all to Fareed for writing this book, not only at high speed, but with extraordinarily high quality. Fareed, thank you so much, and I look forward to continuing this conversation, as we say these days, offline.
Thank you so much, Neil. Thank you, Victor. I'm really honored that you agreed to do this, Victor, and sponsoring it, and particularly honored that Neil would engage with me.